Hello there, traveler. We start today's meditation working our way through the cave. At first it's cold and dry as we work our way through the rock, going deeper and deeper. We begin to fold within ourselves as the passageway becomes tighter, gripping around us as we begin to scuttle our feet across around, locking any loose gravel. Eventually until we get to squeezing just barely through, passing through these tight points, experiencing some pretty intense discomfort. And then eventually it just releases into this big empty space, this void, where you're not sure where up and down even begins. Where even is here. As we're just floating maybe through the ether, maybe through the void, maybe through just the space and whatever spiral or Uzumaki is taking you through. A place that is full of potential, honestly. A place where anything can happen. The most horrific of nightmares or the most dare to dream lucid of potentials. But typically lost in this space, the nightmares make much more comforting friends. Sometimes you need a nice little clear to come back. Recognize that this primordial muck, this darkness is just chaos of potential. Different realities colliding together in this different cosmic wasteland of emptiness, potential. From that sea, from that chaotic particle soup, suddenly you see a flower. This flower roots very clearly stemming deep into the muck. Deep into the muck. Farther down than you're honestly willing to look. But this organized entity, clear as day, is this thing within this space that radiates down past where you can't reach no more. Radiating up, creating something different. Light to the dark. From that, an entity emerges. Someone to be there, in that space with. And sit in the dark. To find security where those loose roots its way down. Someone to use that light, that's something different, to create shadow puppets, to walk yourself through all the different scenarios, to find a shore that is safe to return to. Having someone to be there, to scream into the madnesses and into the empty void to see who can scream the most loud, obscene curse word. To have genocides committed in all these different existential horrors through the different puppet shows. To see all the weird fears come true. Someone to keep trying to be there with. Until one of those puppet shows eventually is potentially doable. Not just a safe shore to do, but a pathway forward. And a way to once again take a step forward on that journey. And let the smoke clear from the fires that were burned on the bridges, from the mistakes that were made, from the wrong actions, the wrong words, the despair, the spiral, the uzumaki, the disdain, the unmindfulness, the lack of presence, the being gone on distant shores. Letting that all release. Letting that all be accepted. As you are part of the story, that means you are part of the story. Whether you like it or not, in your experience, you are the one right here now to take a deep breath as we cleanse from those fires. Take a moment to figure out what is the next right thing to do. Could be anything. Could be just taking a moment to set the order. Take a moment to reflect on the wrong actions that were made. Taking a moment to clear up the road and take recognition into the positive connections and the bright spots that we were able to attain even in the cave. Or maybe we could take a moment. Just take a focus on the breath. Notice what it's doing. Are you stronger on the inhales or the exhales? Are you shallow or deep with your breaths right now? Wherever that breath might find you, may we bring ourselves to this week's question of the week. What was something that wound up being totally different than you imagined it to be? Now, as we take time to reflect at the tavern post-in this time, understanding what the hell is something that wound up totally different than I imagined it to be? So many things, right? Oh, I can think about so many different things in my deconstruction where I'm like, holy fuck. I think one of the things that I really appreciate, honestly, about modern technology, I know there's the issues of potentially the dead internet. I know that there's a lot of propaganda and a lot of bots and a lot of misinformation online. However, and I know there's a lot of paywalls too, I should say too. Information is gatekept online quite hard. And it sucks. It sucks a lot. But I do believe that for the most part, in most places, within reason, a lot of qualifiers as always, you can take the time to research and pretty much understand pretty well anything. And for me, as someone who went to academically study religion, I really do think that for the most part, you can pretty much deal with like a lot of the problems of translation, right? I think that you can actually take it down and you can pretty much, for the most part, get a pretty decent understanding of what any one basic worldview is from both an academic and science perspective and from a real cultural perspective, just by sitting there and watching enough videos online and we're reading enough sources of people who are actually going through these different experiences. Now, always, I think you take the time to vet your sources and understand where they're coming from. But if you want to understand how, potentially a rural villager in northern India lives, right? There's quite a good potential of being able to actually understand what, like, someone, voice in their blog and experiencing what it's like to go through the different seasons there, and especially maybe in a place where the Tibetan government in exile lives too, and actually understanding some of the different sources from pro and against that, right? And like, what is someone actually lives there and be like, hey, this is how we're feeling. It's people like to talk, and Lauren, this is the whole point of this expression right here, right? Is the ability to have that expression. And so I think like one of the things that I find when they really turns out more different than not is like, first and foremost, growing up from a Jewish perspective, realizing how minoritical that was, right? I thought that was very commonplace, and having an old school Abrahamic belief system that really isn't a lot. I had a pretty big misconceptions of what both Christianity and Islam were for a lot of long parts, and for now, if I'm being quite honest with you, I think a lot of the history of Christianity scares me as quite extremistic from history. And I think it's pretty crazy from a lot of different historical perspectives. But at the same time, I realized that, like, what I think the most important things in my deconstruction was realizing that, I grew up in a pro-Zionist environment, and from, the version of Israeli history that I was given was not accurate to the lived history of many millions of people. And, my quote-unquote radicalization, or as I like to say, realistically, my deconstruction into an anti-Zionist really is one of the biggest things that I can really call out today that really comes to mind in something that is different than how I imagined it to be. What do I think of actually being a sustainable solution to peace, for instance, and when there's a current genocide being perpetuated, right? I'm not really for a one government solution there currently with an apartheid state, in essence. Growing up, I think one of the most important things that was really hard to really process and understand that was different was that a lot of the people that I looked up to were not great individuals, right? And like these repeated stories of typically men in these positions of power abusing them and like using them for different advantages, whether it be sexual power or corruption or whatever, different beings, right? A lot of people like that. Deconstruction of that for me, realistically, is one of the biggest things that like kept me into some of the very few people, especially the that I still look up to and everything like that, are be individuals like, for instance, like Steve Irwin, Bob Ross, and these people who seem like generally wholesome from in and out, but like those are not always the most common individuals, but story through historical record. I think that taking the time to actually look and understand who I am as an individual is the biggest thing that has changed for me, and is different though than how I could completely imagine it. I couldn't imagine when I first started my recovery journey that this is where I would take my healing process. Since I got sober off of methamphetamine in May of 2014, my pursuit has been pretty much dedicated to figuring out what that means to be healthy. That has ultimately led now to not being completely abstinent and having substances like marijuana and mushrooms on occasion, and realistically as prescribed medication through my doctors and when needed, through whether they're going through different operations or working through different mental health stuff and everything like that. Actually really had the understanding that my healing journey is not an abstinence-based one all the way through, right? And I know that's a pretty fun one to think about and process, and really understanding like a big part of my healing journey is actually trying to deconstruct what my identity has been and is, and where I want that to be, and understanding that I'm actually a pretty fluid individual. I like to talk about how, for instance, with gender, spirituality and reading Buddhist text literature is really the thing that finally truly broke me about gender. And like, I just don't see in any form of enlightened culture or society or way to be male or female as being no more than a binary construct from human ways to put things in category, and that it's not, there's reasons why Avalokiteshvara and these different bodhisattvas representing all these different figures, both masculine and feminine, because they're not either of them. They're different expressions of these different elements of things, and the reality is much more fluid, and I believe much more in those constant conditions, right? Taking the time to understand that, like, for me, a healing journey, when all I wanted to do was go fast and do methamphetamine and get as much and do as much as experience, that realistically my healing journey has become now just slowing down as much as I can, deconstructing my sense of urgency, working on dealing with anxiety with my mental health professionals, taking the time to really show up and be present and authentic in my relationships, and learning how to build space for myself, taking the time to actually start creating healthy, sustainable relationships with myself, with both my professional environment, the people that I surround myself with, and my family. and trying to figure out like how I can actually create and show up authentically for all those relationships and be here and present with it, and especially with you, traveler, and actually being able to take that moment to sit down specifically and have a conversation here with you. I didn't think that my deconstruction and my healing journey and what my recovery would end up being, and my deconstruction ultimately of myself, not only would end up making me truly gay as fuck, and I do say that with a lot of pride, but as someone who not only believes in radical and redistribution, not just to myself, but to, not even just for myself, I should say, sorry, but to the recognition of non-human consciousness. Not believing that that's ultimately the thing to be advocating for, but most anything else is trying to figure out ways to continue a revolution peacefully in ways that advocates for non-human entities to have an equal say at the table that we all exist in this shared experience. That trying to understand how to exist mindfully in a state where I live in a world that has just vast inequities in my capabilities over that of an ant colony, and an ant colony over myself, and how at this ability of me to panic and try and find a solution to when a line of ants invades my trash, to making sure that I'm advocating and understanding their role in the environmental ecosystem and figuring out how to exist in harmony with them ultimately long term, and so that I don't have a permanent pest extermination relationship with them. Taking the time to learn how to be present and mindful with all my different relationships. It's a process. And I didn't ultimately understand that that would become my journey in what this entire experiment and expression would end up becoming. Ultimately, in this recovery journey, I'm trying to be here with myself and in some essence document to you, traveler, what that experience and experiment is. I'm really exhausted, full, happy, excited, ready to overfill my cup with joy at understanding where this deconstruction goes. I don't know where it goes at this point. I have some general ideas of now, like I think how I want to grow and being intentional about those relationships, for instance, or being mindful about what gardens I want to grow to get to those places where I feel like that will bring me sustainability and hopefully my sustainable actions to other people as well, and being able to make a positive impact and help create greater equity. But I understand that, right? It's going to be completely different than I imagined it to be. Because every iteration that I attempt to do these things, it takes on new means and new explanations and new evolutions. So much is out of my control. But one of the things that I am very grateful for that I have learned is different than how I imagined it to be, is that ultimately I do have control over my reactions. Taking the time to learn, to grow. Taking one step at a time, one fuck up at a time, one success at a time. And with that, thank you for joining me here today, traveler. You are loved, and you are enough.